Today I've got another photography video, this time on depth of field. Let's jump right in. So what is depth of field? Depth of field is the part of the image from near to far that is sharper in focus. A shallow depth of field is when only a small part of the image is in focus and there's a lot of blur in the background. A deep depth of field is when you can see deep into the image, so there's not as much blur and sometimes it's even completely sharp and across the whole image. There are three things that affect depth of field, and those three things are going to be aperture, lens to subject distance, and the focal length of your lens. Aperture is the easiest way to get the most control out of your depth of field because no matter what your situation, you can typically adjust your aperture. The wider open you have your lens, which would be a smaller f-stop or number, would create more shallow of a depth of field. So this is great if you want your subject to be clear and sharp and your background to be with lots of blur with a really shallow depth of field. Whenever you see those super blurry, lots of really great bokeh, that's usually when the lens is opened up all the way, so that'd be the smaller number. In the first example, I used an aperture of 1.4, so my lens was wide open. You'll notice that the camera in front is on focus, and the camera to the left is blurry, and the camera even further back is even more blurry. We've got this really shallow depth of field thing going on right here. In this next image, I used an aperture of 6.3. I focused in the same spot, so the camera in front is still in focus. The camera to the left is a lot more sharper now because we're getting more of a deep depth of field, and you can see the back one more clearly as well. In this last shot, I used an aperture of f22, so all three of the cameras are all completely in focus because it's got a really deep depth of field there. The second thing that affects depth of field is going to be your lens to subject distance. So the closer you are to your subject, the more blur you're going to get behind them. The farther you get from that subject, the deeper the depth of field you're going to get. I have two examples here with the exact same settings. The only thing I changed is how I positioned myself as the photographer. On the left side, I was up close to the subject, so you'll notice there's a lot of blur in the background, really shallow depth of field. And then on the right, you got a photo where I stepped back several feet, and although the cameras behind the main subject are still blurry, they're sharper than they were in the last image. And like I said, these are both have the exact same exposure settings. The last thing that affects depth of field is going to be your lens focal length. This one's pretty simple as well. The longer the lens, the more shallow depth of field you're going to create. Again, with these two examples, they were both shot with the exact same settings. The only thing I changed was the focal length. This first image was shot at 28mm, which is a nice wide angle. You got that blur in the background because I still used a small aperture. I was up close to the subject, so I got a very shallow depth of field. You'll notice there's a lot of blur in the background. And then on the second one, which was shot at 75mm, you'll notice that the bokeh, the blur in the background is a lot more smoother. That's because of the longer focal length. You'll also notice that if you look especially at the lens on the camera there in those images, in the first one you got a lot of distortion because of the wide angle. The second one has a lot less distortion because of the longer focal length as well. So when would you want to use a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? The shallow depth of field is really good if you're wanting to isolate your subject, if you're taking certain detail shots and you really want to focus on that subject. It's also really great for portraits as it isolates the background from your subject, like I said before, and then you really are able to focus on your subject. Deep depth of field is most commonly used in landscapes as you get the whole image in focus so you can see all the details in the landscape. Now I've got some more examples and I'll just talk about the aperture, focal length, etc. that I used to create those images and why. This is a shot I took of my sister back in May in a costume she made for a Star Wars party we had. I used a 50mm f1.4 lens and I shot this at f1.8, so I'm using that wide aperture to get a lot of blur, very shallow depth of field there. 50mm is also a good length to get a shallow depth of field, and it's known as a good portrait lens overall, so you'll notice that she's very isolated from the background, which was the look I was going for. This next shot is a landscape I shot this summer. I shot it at f4, which really isn't as wide as I should have. Looking back at it now, parts of it aren't as sharp as I would have liked, but if you don't blow it up, you can't really tell. For me, I don't really close down my aperture when I should, just because I don't, and I'm lazy, I guess. But sometimes I do like the look it gives it, but like when I'm trying to capture everything and make it sharp, I really need to remember to close down that aperture. That way I can get everything nice and crisp. And when you have your aperture closed down that much, your depth of field's so deep that if you're a tiny bit off focus, you usually can't tell because the depth of field is so deep that it's all usually in focus anyway, so that's another bonus as well. This next shot is at that same location, just a different day, different time of day. This is about an hour before sunset, I think it was. This one's a good example of when I wanted to use a shallow depth of field on a landscape because I wanted all that grass up in front to be blurry. That way you could really focus on the lighthouse in the front. For this image, I used my Tamron 28 to 75mm f2.8 lens. I shot it as wide as I could at 28mm. My aperture was f4.5. That way I still ended up with a sharp, crisp image of the lighthouse, but still had that depth of field and really fun look with the grass blurred out. Here's another example of when I wanted to isolate my subject from the background. In this shot, I wanted to focus on the blackberries in the image and have the rest of the image out of focus. So I used a 50mm lens and I shot this wide open at f1.4. I got that nice, really shallow depth of field, which is exactly what I was looking for. This last shot is of some Christmas lights in my window. I wanted to capture some nice bokeh with the other lights in the background, so I shot this one wide open at f1.4 on that 50mm lens again, and I got some cool twinkle light bokeh in the background. So I hope you enjoyed learning about depth of field today. Let me know what was your favorite part down below in the comments, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye! Get my photo examples. So when would you want to use a shallow depth? Though that's not a hard-bound rule.